Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Denise Easton. I'm currently the chair of the board for Plexus Institute and doer of a lot of other things as well. But I am so excited today to have the women from Human Current. So, and I write this down because I think in the middle of it, I'm going to go off into another conversation. But it's Haley Campbell-Gross and Angie Cross. And the fun part of introducing them is that we've had a number of conversations, and they're my inspiration because they're introducing an entirely new group of people to complexity thinking. And Plexus, as many of you know, has been involved in developing practical applications and asking lots of questions and doing work in the field of complexity, but doing it with people and doing it in messy situations and inviting everybody into the conversation. And so what Haley and Angie are doing is expanding the people who know about the conversations that are happening. So their podcast, and I will put in the links to Human Current podcast, are so cool. And the intersections of people who've been involved in the Plexus world since 2000 and the people that they're talking to just keep intertwining and crossing over. But I'm going to open this up as a pop-up conversation, which means we hope people will ask questions. But I'm going to start it off by asking, why did you guys decide to do this? What was the spark that made you think, you know something, we need to really spend all of our days and nights talking about and thinking about complexity? We're already there, but I'd love to know where you guys started from and what brought you to this point. So I'm going to mute myself, and then we will spotlight you so that we can see your beautiful faces.
All right, you want me to kick it off? Yeah. All right, well, thank you for having us. We're really looking forward to spending some time and chatting with you all. So again, I'm Angie and this is Haley. Sometimes people get us confused, and we're okay with if you call me Haley and her Angie.
Yeah, but no offense taken to that.
We're okay with that. We feel really honored and really blessed to be doing the Human Current podcast. It initially started because he wouldn't want to be called the boss, but the person that owns our umbrella company, HPT Development, was really passionate about getting complexity thinking out to the world. And he really believes that if more people were complexity thinkers, that the world would be a better place. And so when I came on to the team, he said, I want you to get complexity out to the world. And 3 years ago, myself and the team, and Haley joined shortly thereafter, started the podcast, Human Current. And it started first as a project off the side of our desks, and it's really grown into something phenomenal, which we'll get into here in a moment. But we really consider it a passion project of Douglas Drain, our mentor, and has become also our passion. And we really are feel committed to having complexity theory out to the world, and having more people embrace that and believe that increasing that way of thinking will better the world. And so it's really quite an honor.
We do have a little bit of a focus because our name is the Human Current, that why that name, and as far as how to communicate complexity science, we really wanted to focus on the human elements of how this science can really benefit society. And so it kind of came off this idea of flow of people. We have our logo is the infinity sign with a little dot over the top of it, so it kind of resembles human, but also the infiniteness of the human network, human system. So we do tend to focus a little bit more on that aspect of the science, but then we also incorporate a lot of the other fun stuff that has to do with complexity as well.
And we really consider ourselves a hub of other experts in the field. We are not complexity scientists. We are not scientists at all. But we really want to be a hub where we hold space for really deep conversation with other people that are doing phenomenal work.
Mm-hmm.
And those areas of work span across, I mean, we've had series on education, politics, healthcare, and the environment,
Design thinking, leadership, company culture.
everything from I guess from astrophysicists to authors to nutritionists, doctors.
Yeah. And we really, I think there's great benefit in not being complexity scientists ourselves, because we really create that bridge of, I just want to know more about this from a very like humble, I don't know anything kind of place. And so we're creating this very like down to earth conversational platform for people to be introduced to this topic, which has been mostly in academia, and people who come across it a lot of the times they're in physics or in some sort of scientific role, not all the time, but a lot of the times. And so we really try to be that bridge for people to come into this field and learn more about it.
Okay, I'm going to jump in because I think one of the things that intrigued me, so when, and I think everybody here, I just should ask everyone to raise their hands or or to type in if you've been listening to the podcast or if you were familiar with it before today. But someone has sent me one of the podcasts and said, "Hey, do you know these folks?" And this was a while ago, so I guess it was about 2 years ago, and I was like, no, but I do want to get to know them. And I love the fact that in today's world where people are sort of accessing and using media in a way at all times in order to be able to provoke new thinking, like, okay, oh, that's a really cool topic. I'm not an astrophysicist, but there's a connection there to something else. And I really love that concept and that aspect of the work that you're doing, and the way that you sort of provoke different types of conversations with people. And one of the things that we've been doing at Plexus over the last year is saying, why are we relevant, or why do we want to be, or could we even be relevant today? So, because what happened, in 2000 is not necessarily what's happening today, and it certainly isn't the kind of conversations that people wanted to have before. Now, as you know, and this isn't really a Plexus conversation, but as much as anything else, we're sort of like take all this very cool connections and thinking and then start to apply it. So, one of the things that I really like is the fact that you do bring people in there to share what their applications and practice is. And that's really cool. So over the last 3 years since you've been doing the podcast, what are some of the trends that you're experiencing or seeing? And have they shifted significantly, or is it a matter of just being sort of on this just flow through the world of complexity?
Oh, that's a great question.
Yeah, it is a great question.
I think first I just want to recognize, your point around, is it relevant today, and things are different today than they were in, say, 2000.
Mm-hmm.
I agree, things are different. And I would couple that with saying, we feel like complexity thinking and exploring complexity theory is even more relevant today with the increasing uncertainty of the world and how fast things are moving. And so, if anything, it's even more important and critical that we have a complexity thinking lens than ever before.
Absolutely. I think trends, complexity science is all about patterns, right? And I think about this a lot of like, what are the patterns that we're seeing in the conversations that we're having? And there's many. I'm constantly in awe of the new, when we have a big aha and we talk about it after we have an interview. But I think that, finding those there's so many different communities who are talking about the same thing, just with a slightly different language. And it's we're kind of working through what is the language that we're using? Are we talking about an actual theory here, or is this more of a way of looking at the world? And I think that we fall more into the bucket of this is a worldview, this is a perspective of how we see things, and it's really about exploring that together. We talk a lot about, the mechanistic way of life and reductionism and these ways that have helped us in the past, but they're not really helping us anymore. So we really need to readjust. We need to look at that again. And so I think, which area do we start with as far as
Right.
we've done 111 episodes now.
Yeah.
And so lots and lots of conversations have happened, but I'm excited for, my excitement is in how we can innovate that in ways that are more aligned with nature. I think nature is our greatest inspiration. If we can look to things like biomimicry and processes that are happening already all around us and use that to really better align ourselves with what's going on in the natural world, then we'll be much, much better off.
Mm-hmm. I would agree. It's interesting how we just go back to the basics.
I know, right?
To see and understand the complexity.
Those ancient wisdom ways. I mean, we really need to get back to those ways. And even in Chinese cultures, they really had a lot more wisdom than what we're doing here in the Western world.
Yeah, one of our past guests, Meg Wheatley, talked a lot about that and has a lot of wisdom around that. So
Meg Wheatley was a huge highlight for us. We've been quoting her work for 3 years, and we finally, got an opportunity to talk with her, and it was just one of those moments that I don't think we'll ever forget.
Yeah.
Among the various people that you interviewed, you say that the focus is on the application. What's an application that you saw that just surprised you, enlightened you, really?
Oh, that's a good question.
We recently did, the 9th International Conference on Complex Systems. We were the official podcast for this event in Boston this past July. And I think that's where we really heard the most stories of application, because these are scientists who are in it every day. They're around other scientists at this conference. And so a couple of really cool ones that we heard were, I think, Irene and Yelena really stick out to me. They were talking about infectious diseases. And so Irene Bosch is an infectious disease researcher, and she's at MIT, and she works with a mathematician. And they basically they explore questions together about what's happening in the world, where infectious diseases are happening, and then they get together and explore mathematical models for how the disease could spread, potential cases of epidemics. And so that was really, really interesting. Their relationship.
I think of like Yinir Bar-Yam's work as well. With NEXI, New England Complex Systems Institute, and he's really applying complexity thinking every day. I also think of examples of flocking and was it James Grayson? James Grayson for sure, as he talks about the environment and how he applies complexity theory to his work with the security.
Yinir Bar-Yam we've had on the show, I believe 4 times now.
Yeah, I think
3 or 4 times. We took one of his episodes and split it into 2. But basically, he's the president of the New England Complex Systems Institute. He's majored in physics and then has gone on to start this institute and really do a ton of research and application to the field. His research is all over the place in application. Looking at the economy and how we need to inject money into the labor markets as opposed to the other system, the consumer market. So that aspect, as well as he's really focusing on epidemics right now, a lot of his research. As far as application, I think he's mostly on the research side though, and less application. We've talked with a ton of researchers who are looking at complex systems and collecting the data. The next step is, what do we do with this data? It's kind of the big problem that I think all of us are facing, especially the complexity systems community, because they see the potential of all this data, but then doing something with it is the tricky part. But there's a lot of opportunity in the field.
I think we could probably, I'm like racking my brains going crazy thinking of the list of people that we've interviewed and all of the areas that they've shared example of application. And then I go back to even us as an example of how we've applied elements of systems theory into our work. I mean, the podcast really is a case study of trusting emergence, and we really dissect feedback loops within our own with our own work and our relationship. And so, I mean, Haley and I have we open up some deep conversations and explore complexity theory as it relates to our own lives and our own work as well. I kind of wish we would do a little bit more of that behind the mics.
I think we're really, really blessed, though, to have not only a small, intimate team, because Angie and I are really close friends, but we also work in an environment where we can come in and bring our whole selves to work. So we have a very unique situation. I know the workplace is not always set up that way. There's not a lot of bureaucracy here, but it's just, it's crazy what that kind of relationship can do for the workplace, and the inspiration that comes out of that, and the fact that we're motivated by this mission. You know, all of that coming together really drives what we do.
Yeah, it allows us to get curious and ask questions of why not versus just why. But yeah, like just opening up is very expansive.
I, of course, have a billion questions, but I really want to keep this open for other folks to jump in. And one of the nice things about the people who are actually here right now, they're all, actively involved in different kinds of projects that somehow are intersecting or emanating from Plexus. And so it's also cool to think that you guys could start to share, the people who are on with Angie and Haley, some of the work that you're doing. And I just had, all of a sudden light bulb went out and I thought, wow, wouldn't it be great to have you as this outside viewer looking in a project? So maybe during the course of a project, coming into a meeting or into one of these conversations where there were updates, and you were able to sort of share some connections and say, yeah, what if, or, oh, I don't understand. And I think that that's one of the things that is exciting about what's happening today, is that we have people who are not necessarily the researchers and the scientists. And Yaner is a friend, and he's just so fabulous. And I always throw these, I say, not even softballs at him, like, okay, this is all great data, but what are we doing with this? And so I love the fact that you guys could potentially be doing this. So that's just another thing to add to our collaboration list. But I'm going to be quiet. Barb or Mike, Neil, if any of you would like to jump in with a question or something, please feel free to do that.
I'll jump in. So I think that one of the things, and this is to either one of you, Haley or otherwise, what I think is that we're experiencing is kind of a global dissatisfaction with the Newtonian and that mechanistic and that reductionist way of thinking, because it's just not getting the answers that we're looking for. And that's true not only in the scientific but the non-scientific community. There's a black hole physicist I follow in Germany, Sabine Hassenfelder, who wrote a book about physics and how physics is supposed to be very objective, but use a lot of subjective language in what they do. And what I've found is that, particularly within the scientific communities, they can't even rely entirely upon objective information. They have to bring subjective information in also. Otherwise, the conversation kind of stops. So I think that people are experiencing the possibility of complexity without actually being able to name it, and going beyond, beyond that objective and that linear thinking.
Yes, definitely. We had a past guest on the show, Jeremy Lind, who said, I think complexity in systems thinking has a bit of a marketing problem.
Yeah.
And as someone with a marketing background, I can say, yes, we do. Definitely. The language is like we know the ideas, we have it in our head, but we don't know really where to go to look for it or what it's called. And that's definitely something that we struggle with as far as how do we bring new people into the conversation who are thinking the things that we're thinking, who are having the conversations that we're having, and just don't know the language. Or, I mean, how many people can say, oh, I have a mentor who, told me about complexity science, and now I'm doing a podcast. It's a very strange way to come into the field, very blessed way, but it is an issue that we face. I think talking about reductionism too, we catch ourselves with the language that we use all the time. And I mean, we're in this, 3 years of podcasting and having these conversations about complexity, and I still catch myself falling into the trap of reductionism or reductionist language. And I talk to Angie all the time about this process of unlearning and unlearning what we essentially have been told our entire lives, and how we have studied, and how we've carried out our work. And it's not an easy it's not an easy thing to do. It's quite painful.
And with that, we also talk about like awakening our conscience, and when we're awoke, when our conscience has been awoken, then we can't go back to sleep. And then I believe with that, we have a responsibility then to continue the conversation outwards. And so not just here, but then how do we share these ahas and learnings with other people?
Yeah, it's crazy how many fields we have the potential of talking with and really diving into. We tend to err more towards the ones that we find we are most passionate about, or that we really feel like can change the world, like sustainability, talking with people who are dealing with social issues, environmental issues, political issues, and then they all intertwine. And you're like, okay, where does the conversation start or stop?
Where does it?
No.
Yeah.
Oh, it doesn't. One of the things that it's interesting, because I think that you just brought up, and thanks, Mike, he brought it up too, this concept of people are dealing with things that they're not aware of. I mean, they are aware, but they just don't know how to name it. But also, there's this huge gap between understanding and then saying, okay, where do I find what I need and who can I go to? And one of the things that I have to admit I have sort of confronted is, if you don't have multiple PhDs and you aren't doing what I will call sort of institutional academic-based research, that the vetting and validity of the work that's being done is often not valued as much as if you're working within that institution. And as we all know, that isn't necessarily where some of the best data is coming from. It's great data, but you've already said, how do you use it? And so do you think that there is a greater acceptance for bridging those two universes or ecosystems? Or do you think that both sides have to sort of be thrown into the soup, so to speak, and let them try to swim or not?
Ooh, yeah, go for it.
I mean, both probably. For a little while, I think it's going to take a little while for that to, for the tipping point of that, unfortunately. But I do think that these fields like design thinking, where people who, I mean, I know designers who don't have degrees, and they've come up with amazing ways to design out the problems that, those wicked problems that are facing organizations. So with fields like that, there's a lot of potential. I think, people are coming, they're not even going to school for computer science and that kind of thing. They're just diving right into the field. And the whole premise of design thinking is you just you learn from your feedback, you learn from mistakes, and you iterate over and over again, and you keep the user in mind, you know, and design everything around that. There's a blog on our website about Dr. Russell Akoff, and he talks a lot about designing out problems, basically, like design is the answer. So I think with that regard, there's definitely potential for people who aren't you know, going through the whole institutional educational process that can really bring about some great change. And proof is in the pudding. I mean, they're making great changes, and people are seeing that, and so that creates the validity.
Mm-hmm. It kind of makes me think, as you're talking, Haley, about our interview with Dave Snowden and Professor Snowden talking about introducing chaos and poking for chaos, and sometimes we need a little bit of that, and sometimes it has to come from a multidisciplinary perspectives, and I think that was a great example with the ICCS conference that Nexi put on, where there was so many disciplines coming together, and ones that you wouldn't expect, hard science mixed with soft science,
Still
mixed with no
PhDs.
science. Yeah, a lot of PhDs.
Still a ton of PhDs there.
Yeah, and I think that that's where the great conversation and the richness comes from. I think it's really easy for us to be in an echo chamber.
Well, the elections are coming up, and I think that one of the areas that we can really see people starting to like doubt the system and say, you know what, this isn't a yes or no, this isn't a left or right scenario. We need to explore these other options that are available to us. And that is opening people's eyes to the old ways of doing things, and that we really need to start a new conversation. I don't know if complexity is necessarily tied to that conversation. I hope that it is. I think words like nuanced and complex are going to come up, and then hopefully people start realizing, oh, there's a whole science to this.
Right.
I believe, I believe that's absolutely true, but I'd like to put it more of I'm going to jump off your political spin there.
Yeah.
And tell you the story of, I forget his last name now, but as a physician, his first name is Peter. He joined my institution, Johns Hopkins. He's a complexity science in the area of infection and infection control. And once he became part of our wonderful linear institution, he was entirely swallowed up and ended up getting spit out on the other side, kind of. And what I feel is that the institutions use linearity as a way of maintaining certain power structures and allowing some conversations and disallowing other conversations. And one of the reasons why complexity goes across a variety of scientific disciplines, and even people without the doctorate in a science, is because it allows those conversations that previously hadn't taken place. And the reason I got involved in complexity is because in my own area of diabetes and working with people with diabetes, I found that the linear options that were given to me to work with people just did not work. But I was essentially told, well, these are the tools you have, and just use them and don't question them.
Well, that's not effective. That's another part of complexity, and I think the difference between, say, the Plexus strategies versus the PhD strategies, where all of the PhDs that you were talking about are looking at data and trying to understand what it means. Whereas in Plexus, we sort of dive in and figure out what's going on. And that in many ways, data is unimportant because all we're looking for is results. So that we can produce results, but in some ways we can't produce data. And it's all proved through storytelling, which is obviously very suspect in the academic setting. And yet we see phase changes where everybody starts doing things differently and nobody can point to why. And I'm just wondering how we're going to legitimize that, because even design thinking is find a problem and solve it. It's a different strategy for solving problems, whereas with complexity, you just enter in and understand that you can change behavior and change results without even knowing what results you want to get or what behavior you're changing. And that's a real difference. And I think that's our problem. I see somebody said the data emerges out of the action. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would agree to that.
I think that on the design thinking point, I highly recommend looking up our interviews with John Kolkel. We've talked to him twice on the show, and he would probably twist my arm for even calling it design thinking because he's so anti-buzzword. But he talks about this as more of a creative, messy process that we have to embrace the chaos and kind of intervene like you were talking about. I really think that he's more in line with our complexity thinking storyline as opposed to the design thinking, because they make it sound like it's step, 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 and then an amazing result. And that's not really the case of what he was talking about. He talks about there is this wonderment in the chaos that you have to dive into and weed out, and it's okay to, fail fast, those kind of elements. But it's definitely true that a lot of organizations weed out people who are in that complexity frame of mind,
Mm-hmm.
and they don't last. We've talked with a lot of people who have their own consultants, who have basically, they go from the outside into organizations
Mm-hmm.
to find a way to reach them and make change.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I do consulting on the side, and it's one of the things that I recently did. I worked with an organization in a city here in Texas, where I came in from the outside to poke poke from the outside and shift some culture and do some changes there, organizational change, but really starting with each individual and then a cultural shift within the organization. And really a lot of that, we talked about application earlier and the question around how do we apply it. And that's a great example of using what we've learned here on the human current and applying that in my own consulting work. And I have 20 plus years in child welfare work, and this contract was not within the child welfare, but it's very similar as you look at systems and how do we change that. And I think one of the key components to that is the storytelling piece of that. And that I think this is shifting, that storytelling is becoming more of the data, and that there's more relevancy. Even when I did my master's in leadership, that was a focus of part of my data collection was the stories and finding themes there. And so really recognizing that the storytelling has huge value, and we see that also with design thinking. It's what is the story behind what's going on, and how do we shift that?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I do think it's interesting because I think Snowden, I'm sure, mentioned this. I mean, his whole concept of every organization has their story. And so it's that combination of, sort of the humanity in the system, the complexity of the interactions between them, and then the data that's emerging, and how are you going to be able to start to make sense making, which is Dave's big thing, of all of those different components. And the stories, if there's anything, it's the concept of the stories being such a human, emotional, intellectual, physical, and I'm going to turn this back to Barb in a second, experience, because they can't be, as soon as they're unbraided, then what happens is that they become chapters. They don't become a full story. And that is one of the things that I think, as we start to look at the different pieces or patterns, components of the organization from a complex view, from a systemic view, we can unbraid them to understand them, but at some point in time for them to operate effectively, they have to come back together. And Karen's here, and I hope that you jumped in. If you want to unmute yourself and jump in, please do so. It's always just an open conversation. We go in a multitude of different directions. Likewise for Bob and Neil. But Barb, would you like to just jump in a little bit about that sort of integrative messiness of those stories that we tell ourselves and that we create with others? Because I think Haley and Angie might like to hear a little bit more about that too. And then, of course, you guys have to respond.
So some of this is Amanda Lyons, Denise, and I are working on something we're calling the Awarefulness Project, which is this recognition that we have developed ways of communicating that filter knowledge that if you don't have the proper word, then you're not going to be able to communicate what you're thinking. And so we are using drawing not merely as a visual representation of something, but literally drawing as the start of a conversation to be interpreted by the other. So it could be as little as the difference between how you make a straight line and how I make a straight line. And it's actually quite different. I mean, we're used to this with handwriting, that everybody's handwriting is quite different. And so we're using this cooperative drawing as part of a conversation in order to create awareness not only between people, but also internally, because I do think that the verbal component of communication has filtered our own self-knowledge, and that when we start getting in tune with ourselves, we start then opening ourselves up to possibilities that we see, but we don't know how to name. And this is kind of, the Awarefulness Project starts getting very inarticulate as I start getting deeper into what is happening internally, because we're so used to thinking of our internal experiences being right here, and yet we have an entire body, and our body is connected to the environment, and we can feel the environment in a way that we can't think the environment. And so it's by connecting inward and sharing this inward connection externally, we're creating a possibility of communication that we're just not happening when we're stuck here.
Thank you for sharing so much about that project. That got me really, really excited.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was good.
We've talked so much about doing an episode or talking about linguistics too.
Mm-hmm.
And it's come up, it's been a pattern of people who have a background in linguistics we've talked to, but we haven't had a full-on conversation about it. And I think it's really, really important. And sadly, in the English language, at least how I'm used to communicating it here in America, is that very reductionistic.
Mm-hmm.
And it's hard to communicate ideas without pulling that language in.
Yeah, Jeremy Lent talked about that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It also made me think of Florence, one of our guests, an author, Florence, who talks about our experiences that happen here and that we need to, she talks about connecting with nature so that we have that different experience. And then Helen, I believe it was, that talks about it's a very kind of Western world that we have our five senses, and other cultures and places around the world see like our intuition and our gut feeling and that being part of our five senses. And so in terms of our language, we express also through our experiences. And so if we're experiencing with our Western five senses, then it's a different kind of language set.
I think that was Radical Wholeness.
Yeah. Oh yeah, Radical Wholeness. Yeah.
I highly recommend this Radical Wholeness. And it's by Philip Shepard. We interviewed him, I think, early this year, the beginning of this year. And Radical Wholeness was, not only is he an amazing writer. I mean, I was captivated by this book. He's very poetic. And he talks about so many different cultures, like what Angie was sharing about our frame of mind, like from the very beginning of how we speak our language and how we're stuck in our heads. And he explains metaphors that we use even in the world of, he explained like the car is an extension of our heads. That's why we have headlights. And so that kind of becomes an extension of ourselves. And we have headquarters. And I just, all these kind of like connections came, and it just made me think about things in a totally different way. And I thought, oh my gosh,
Yeah.
We don't even know.
Yeah, we're so much up here. I know my kiddo, who's now 23, but when he was little, I would ask him if his feelings were coming from up here or from right here. Is he thinking it or feeling it? And we get stuck in our head so much. And I think that, our language comes from that place, like headquarters, head of the table, etc., versus our
and the value that we put on jobs where you use your mind as opposed to you use your body. You think about, we just don't see the value in labor work, and it's just really racked with, I don't think that we really align with these values either. I think they're just pushed down on us, and then we feel very uncomfortable and we don't know why.
Did we touch where you're headed, or did we just do what we do?
I'm not what did you mean by that question of where are you headed?
Where the project is, where your question and around the awarefulness, is that?
We have been working on it. We're seeing overlap with some of the other projects happening in Plexus. For example, Bob and I had an amazing conversation about how tools, once you start to use a tool, say you use a hammer, and that's so much more effective than your fist, that your arm is forever changed because your arm could use a hammer. And so that the moment you make a connection with something more than what you've been using, you are forever altered. That it's not merely I have this external tool, your arm changes too. And so there's some crossover there with the Awarefulness Project. And it's also, I don't know Shepard, but I do recall how my mind exploded when I read Lakoff on, what is the Lakoff book, guys? I can't remember the one about the metaphor in mind. And honestly, oh my gosh, if you guys could get George Lakoff on, oh my gosh, because he's the man. And also there was a book that I read years ago about how the brain is developed depending on the language that you grow up in. And so that quite literally you see differently depending on the language that you've grown up in. And all of this seems to be coming together in this letting go of language. It's not, we have this tool and it's pretty much the best tool we've got right now, but we should improve it and add to it and expand it. I mean, the Awarefulness Project only works in conversation. Doesn't work as just, I want to learn about myself. It requires conversation between. And so that you then have someone on the outside, and it's that in between that you start developing a new reality. We've been taking it around. I'm presenting at the Organizational Development Conference Sunday, and then also I've been invited to the International Society for Performance Improvement in April, and so people are beginning to hear about this, and we're just right now experimenting and seeing what it all means.
Well, if we were not muted, you would have heard Haley and I going, So we're very excited about it. And as you're talking about the hammer and the arm, and that it's about a conversation, not just, we talk about ego-driven versus community-driven. It makes me think of how interconnected we are, and this lesson, and who's it that says, Tim, that says you tug on one thing in the universe and it pulls on something else. Yeah, that's what it reminds me of. So we love that. If there is anything, we should continue our conversation around how can we help promote that work and put a spotlight on it. I think that's really exciting conversation and great work needed.
Yeah, it's so true too. Like being an open system and feeding for, getting feedback from the environment, that's how we are living systems. We shouldn't think about it any other way. It's just detrimental. So I'm really glad that you brought that up too, that we really need to have that feedback. That's what keeps us going. That's how you learn. That's how you grow.
I just have a quick question. Do you all know it? Are most of you from the Plexus Institute? Like who? I'm trying to get the ecology of our system here.
Oh, this is good.
Yeah.
Well,
we are not personally associated with Plexus.
I see human current.
Yeah. We've interviewed Denise, and we're going to be airing her interview next month, I believe.
So we're a podcast, and just a platform for interviewing and talking with members of the complexity community. So when we came across Denise when we did the Complexity Live event, so we partner with Complexity Labs and facilitate conversations very similar to your pop-ups on Complexity Labs YouTube channel. So that's how we met.
How about you, Karen?
I'm an organization development consultant. I do coaching. I've been in the field for years, and I've over the last, well, actually, it would be a long story, but I've been involved in around the complexity world for quite a long time. I do have a doctorate. I finished it just a couple of years ago, but I had started it many years ago, and it was hard work. But and I used, when I began that work, when I began that doctoral work, which was quite a few years prior, and then I took a big break, I was introduced to Will McWhinney. I don't know if any of you know of Will's work. And Will really got me thinking about a number of things, but I became very interested in the notion of social fields. And my doctoral work actually ended up, I looked at how we create collective transformational learning spaces. And because throughout my work, I've had these moments when I'm working with a group and it's palpable, the group shifts to a deeper level of thinking and listening. And my work became more focused on enabling those shifts and what are the conditions. And so that was what I researched. And I used the language we use a lot in, I think, variety of environments is around holding. But I don't know that we really understand what that is. So we talk about, I'm holding the space, I'm holding the, what do we really mean? And what are we speaking to, both in terms of our hearts and our heads? So I looked at the origin of that language and married that work that really comes from a man named Donald Winnicott, and married that with Kurt Lewin in Social Fields. And as I looked at the stories, because it was about stories, of people who have had an experience of holding environments that shift to those deeper levels of conversation. And they're doing something different than traditional facilitating. And it really is about a relationship with the social field, with the space, not with the individuals or even the group or topic. And I'm not quite sure how to enter this conversation, but so I'm bringing that into my work. I'm looking for a place to have a home with it in some ways, and talk to people about it and continue to flesh it out, and who get it, because I talk to a lot of people about it who walk away using the language and still don't really know what I'm talking about. And so I'm just emerging from a huge deep dive into some work at the state level and here in California, and rethinking about where I want to position things next. And so there were a couple comments that I thought along the way. One was that I tried to create a dynamic model, because it wasn't a do this, look for that, right, that people want, but it was really because as people talked about this, they used models of dance and music. And so I created a model that is it has energy in it. It's about the emergence and the relational component of the holder with the space. And the second thing is maybe a little more provocative and maybe way out there. But the other thing I've begun to be a little more involvement is some inclusion work within my university. And a lot of the people who I ended up interviewing do a lot of inclusion work. And I have to say, when I'm around the complexity world, it looks very white. And I don't know what to make of that. And because I think the inclusion work, I was just on a call this morning with somebody who I brought in at the state level on this project I was working on. We were wrapping up, and he's Latino. And he was asking about my dissertation, and I was telling him about it. And so we were talking about its applicability to the inclusion space, but it really comes out of the complexity world and out of relational, out of complexity leadership, this marriage of field theory and the space between us, which is Winnicott's work. So anyway, I don't know what that all means. Just dump it into the forum, into the middle, and see what we make of it. But that's what led me to come along today, and I'm whatever you want to make of that.
Yeah.
And and by the way, I love the head and the heart stuff, Barb. I have to tell you, there's a woman who I work with, and I'm going to be doing a workshop with her, who looks at, her whole research is around white women understanding their whiteness through a very integrated head and heart. So it's a somatic process. And she's doing this work in the world with really helping white women through their somatic experience of being white and what that means. So those were all the connections I was making as I was listening.
I'm going to let Haley and Angie jump into this, but this is what happens at Plexus.
Okay.
Thank you. I was afraid it wasn't going to happen in this magical way. Karen, fabulous. Okay. Please type in that chat your contact information. Yes. And wow. And this is the lead in back to Angie and Haley. I think the international complexity world is far more diversified. And I think that they have, I'm being really bold. There's maybe a desperation and a freedom and an openness in many other social and governmental and larger systems that exist that don't exist in the US, where I do think that the power structures are far more rigid and formalized. And
here?
So, yes, in the US. So we'll make of that whatever we want to make of that, but I'm turning it over to you.
I don't even know where to start. It was really rich. I'm really excited about the work that you're doing and some of your past experiences. I thought of the People's Institute as you talked about inclusion. I used to do some work around undoing institutional racism when I worked in the child welfare industry, and it was mind shifting, heart shifting, and being Canadian, moving to America, and then going through the People's Institute for undoing institutional racism was a big eye opener coming from Canada. And now I've been in America for a long time. So I think of the People's Institute and their work around inclusion. I would say, in my experience, is that many systems I don't want to just peg the Western world, but I'll say America, from my experience with different systems, is predominantly would be white in terms of leading a charge and loving when people step forward and say, well, how about inclusion, and how do we do that, especially as we recognize our whiteness in those systems. And I think that complexity is one of those areas, one of those systems that has a lot of whiteness. Even at the conference that we attended, there was definitely, in terms of, it was pretty diverse, but there was definitely a predominant more whiteness, and I want to say male. There was a lot of men.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
So we're definitely shifting, and that goes way back to women's brains not being studied, and if you go upstream and look at science and how that is formed and how that translates into today's workings in science, in the world of science. So
it is shifting. I wish it would shift a little faster.
Yeah.
But
Yes.
It's shifting. I really enjoyed hearing about your research, Karen. That was very inspiring and cool to think about the possibilities that could happen in that space, holding space, and that is very similar to the stories that you tell me about your consulting work, Angie, and just the amount of power in creating that moment of silence or stillness within a room of people or within a group of people. I mean, that act alone can provide space for things you didn't expect to emerge. Sometimes it's just about being a listener. And that's probably the number one thing that I could take away if, whatever is left up for me in the future, being a good listener after holding these conversations, just really connecting with people through that act and holding space for those moments of silence to see what else is going to come from this, what are they going to say next? And there's great value in that. And to the inclusion point as well, we talked with a gentleman called Paolo Gaudiano. I hope I'm saying his last right, Gaudiano. He used to work for Ecosystem, which they do a ton of complexity simulations. Excuse me. So it's a very very interesting organization that he was, I believe, CTO for. But now he's actually doing a lot of diversity and inclusion work. But with that complexity background, complexity language, he has a blog on Forbes. I don't know if he's still writing for them. We talked to him back in January. I believe The Complexity of Diversity is the name of the blog on Forbes. And so we've been following his work on diversity and inclusion, but he's a really great voice for what's to come in that field.
Great human too.
He's a wonderful human.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
Well, we're up to our time, but if we can have a few more questions, and if you aren't in a big rush, just if anybody has any follow-up questions or comments, I mean, we could do this forever. I did type in the chat that we really hope that we can have closer collaboration with Human Current, because I feel like we can really together align and open up the world of complexity thinking as a bridge to a multitude of different practices actually in the field, and as well as the conversations about them. But I'm going to be quiet now and then turn it over to the audience and then let you guys sort of wrap it up.
So just to mention the project I'm working on with complexity that may have some connections to various topics that were brought up. Make it very brief. I've started what's called the Commons Project, which is an environmental health app that is based within the blockchain of what's called a distributed autonomous organization. And the goal of this is to make what's invisible visible, our impact on the environment, make that visible. So as we do things, we can see what the actual impact is on the environment. And one of the things that we're going to create with this is to have a digital coin that people will get paid based upon their positive impact on the environment. And to connect it both to your talk about labor and the talk about diversity, we found that the most interesting thing about this is the valuing of the coin, and what does it mean for valuing, and having the conversation of what is valuable versus what is not valuable, including in terms of the human contribution, not just leaders, but the population itself. Has been very informative, and it's also been remarkably difficult to increase the diversity, even as I've reached out to organizations like Van Jones Dream Corps. I reached out to Girls Who Code and a couple of other organizations, and they're just into what they do, even if there are connections across. I found a lot of, even within these organizations that seek to increase diversity, at the same time, they seem to be weirdly isolated. And you almost have to be an organization in order to engage with an organization. Only the big people can play with the big people, and so on.
What was the name of the project?
It's called the Commons Project.
Commons.
Okay. That is,
it sounds so familiar.
yeah. And also very exciting because we are tomorrow going to have Complexity Live on building network organizations. We're going to talk about data analytics and networks with, hold on, I don't want to butcher their names, so I'm just going to read them. Trent McCohey, he's the founder of Ocean Protocol, which Ocean Protocol sounds very similar to what you're talking about, where they're incentivizing through the blockchain people to share data, so data is not locked up in power structures. So kind of the similar, and that is in beta, I believe. They haven't actually launched it yet, but you should check out Ocean Protocol. It looks very exciting. He's also got a background in AI. I think he's got one of the number one thesis on AI. So he's an interesting guy. But also Mihaela, I can't pronounce her last name. Can you pronounce her last name?
Amazing Human? No, I can't remember.
She's chief alchemist at Endor. And Endor is in with Alex Pentland, Sandy Pentland, and social physics. And then they also are doing a lot of work with blockchain as well, and emerging technologies. So she's going to be on there. And also Michael Zargum, the founder of Block Science. We met him at the Nexi conference, and Diego Espinosa, also in the blockchain world. So we're going to have 4 amazing guests talking for an hour. It should be probably longer than an hour, but
yeah, feel free to and jump in. Like, so we'll be something similar to this, and then they have a conversation online for anybody to chime in through chat box. And Denise has been on Complexity Live before as well. It's one of our collaborations with Complexity Labs out of Ireland.
Yes, Ireland. Although they're kind of all over their team.
Yeah. But we'd love to learn more about, so Ocean Protocol. We'll be checking out that work and love to hear more about that too.
Yeah, that's definitely in line with that conversation that we're having and keeps coming up too.
Mm-hmm. And to your point, like Mike, we've seen that too, where people find it hard to break through an organization unless they're an organization. I wish we had some like solid advice or a key person for you to contact. I just, keep on keeping on, because it's, and we'll love to, we really do consider ourselves a hub, and a connector of other people. And so, if we connect with people that are a good fit, we'd like to pass on your contact information, if that's all right with you.
Completely, yes. Thank you.
Great.
Yeah. Anyone else have any news? We have a little bit more for as far as what's to come for episodes on the Human Current. We have Linda Buswini coming up.
Yes.
Angie talked with Linda Buswini. And we also have Laszlo Barabasi. He's coming up, a network scientist. So those are big names that we're super excited about sharing, and that will be before the end of the year. So stay tuned.
And Denise's episode will be coming out before the end of the year, along with Stephen Harding from
Schumacher College. Stephen Harding was amazing too, because he's leading the holistic science course at Schumacher College in the UK, and it's the only master's holistic science program in the world. And he's just blew our mind with Gaia theory and what they're doing with the school. It's amazing stuff.
And shoot, y'all, like his stories, talk about storytelling. He's the only interview that I did cry while he was talking. I know, it was muted. I was like, this story, talk about the hammer attached to the arm. His story touched my heart, and forever, that a story that he shared in his interview. So we're excited to share that, although we're trying to edit out the crying part.
I say leave it in.
Exactly.
Isn't that part of it? It is the way that to me, part of this is where we live and how interconnected we are. We are like, the scientific application is about how we interconnect and impact each other. How do we begin to really unpack that and understand that piece of what transforms us and the systems that we build through all these social constructs that we have? So I say, leave it in.
Thank you for
But
that.
it's not me.
I think the awkward part is
I don't know you,
we mute on our end while they're talking, and so it's just more this like all of a sudden it's clear that I was emotionally affected by his story. Yeah,
It was
thank
beautiful to witness.
Maybe sniveling is good.
Thanks, I appreciate that.
Oh, this has been an incredible amount of fun. I mean, I always use that word because it is always so much fun to be in a pop-up, but to have the two of you sharing it and to have your energy coming across, we really appreciate it. So hope this is just the first of many. Okay, so I guess that was my fourth time that I put in the plug, but thank you for, being with us today, and then for all the work that you're doing. And this is just, we're all in this together. We're swimming in this beautiful ocean, and the more connections we can make and the more ideas that come across, that's where we make a difference individually and as groups and as organizations. So thank you very much. And we will be posting this and sharing the links so you can share it within your community too. And love the podcast. So yay. Thank you.
Thanks for having us, and thank you for all of you to be on today and all the great conversation. Appreciate it.
We loved learning about your work, and let us know if we can help you promote what you're doing. We'd love to have you on the show sometime. Thank you.
Thank you.